Hello everybody and welcome back to COMM2332 Media and Society. Welcome to our new online version of this course where, thanks to the COVID-19 virus, the lectures will now be me recording what I would normally teach you all, but instead of an in-person lecture, I will do it over a series of slides and audio like this. Instead of a basic hour and 15 lecture like I would normally do on Tuesdays and Thursdays, my plan is to break up each lesson into a series of smaller videos. That's going to make it easier on your attention spans, and it's going to make it easier on me recording. Also, I want to apologize if the audio quality for these aren't at times fantastic. You're probably going to hear my mouse clicking. You're probably going to hear my keyboard clacking through some of this. That's because I'm using my laptop's built-in microphone. Unfortunately, given the circumstances and how little time we've had to prepare to get all this stuff put together, this is about the best I could do, and I'm going to try to make the best of it. Now, just a quick note about this week's assigned chapter. The chapter is called Interactive Media, and it covers pretty much all sorts of interactive media, from the internet to smartphone apps. The chapter does a really good job focusing on the early invention of the internet, where it came from, the ideology that helped invent it, how it spread through American society and was adapted by different groups. And it's all really fascinating stuff, and I am going to pull some quiz questions from that, but it's not what we're going to focus on today. With this set of topics, one of the first things we're going to focus on is video games. The chapter talks a little bit about video games, but I want to focus on them just because I think it makes for a fun distraction, and I think a lot of you are probably playing a lot of video games at home now that you can't really leave the house much. Another really interesting thing about video games as it fits into the whole chapter and what we're talking about here is the crash that it went through, which is what we're going to focus this lesson on, but more on that in a second. So just if we can lay out why it is video games are so important, or why we can talk about them on the same level as some of these other forms of mass media that we've discussed. Video games are a $90 billion industry, and that's just in the United States. If you look at it globally, particularly in Europe and Japan and parts of South America, video games are a huge economic boom to the tech sectors in a lot of places. And the people playing games are also very diverse. About 155 million people in the United States alone play some kind of video game on a weekly basis, whether that's on a console or on a personal computer or even in smartphone apps. Video games are all around us. Video games are consistently sort of everywhere throughout our interactions with mass media, even if we're not thinking about them all the time. But the thing we're going to focus on with this series of PowerPoints to tell this full story is that video games have gone through something that pretty much no other platform that we're going to or have talked about in this class involving mass media have ever gone through. And that is a crash and a recovery. And what I mean by a crash is a very specific downturn, a very sudden downturn in the number of people buying things on this platform, buying the hardware necessary to interact with it. Now, we've talked about some downturns in various forms of mass media in this class up to this point. We've talked about how magazines have had a really sharp decrease in the number of sales. We've talked about how print newspapers have had a really sharp decrease in the number of subscriptions and how they're really struggling to figure out how to make money still. Even just the week before we all had to leave for spring break, we were talking about how the television industry is running into some problems with the amount of money that's being paid for certain TV shows, and how Netflix, despite being very popular, is in a great deal of debt. But none of these are really crashes. With magazines and with newspapers, they are slow decreases over time. We're not talking about something dropping off of a cliff. Video games dropped off of a cliff. In 1983, there was a catastrophic crash in the video game industry. And we're going to talk about what caused the crash, and then we're going to talk about what got out of the crash. But before we get into it, we have to look at, okay, well, at the very cursory glance, who or what is responsible for this crash? And unfortunately, we do have to start here. This is on the right in this photograph is a video game developer from a long time ago called Harold Scott Warshaw. And unfortunately, Harold Scott Warshaw takes a lot of the blame for the video game crash. And that's not really fair, because it's not like he crashed the whole industry on his own. Did he make a thing that was pretty crummy and helped contribute to it? Absolutely. But he certainly is not the only reason that video games crashed in the year 1983. So, before we can get into talking about what causes the crash and how we get out of the crash, first we have to figure out how we actually get to the point that we have video games to start with. Now, what I want you to do is keep in mind as we go through this presentation and as we're talking about the history of all this stuff, that the line in the sand for the Great Crash is 1983. That is where everything goes belly up. But until then, let's just think about how it is we get there. There are some early things we might call, in the history of technology, in the history of human media, video games from a very early standpoint, but they were pretty rare. There was these two things. The thing on the left is called Birdie the Brain. Birdie the Brain was a traveling technology exhibition toy. They called it a toy, but it took up a huge amount of space. It was a massive computer system that in the 1950s they would travel around with and show off. And the main trick is that you could play tic-tac-toe against it. You would press buttons corresponding to the X's and O's that you wanted, depending on which one you were. And then the computer would think about what move to play against you and would light up an X or an O on the screen. It couldn't do anything else except for light up those X's and O's, and was primarily designed to show off the computing power that the Birdie the Brain had. You could never buy one. It was only for showing off purposes. On the right here, what we have is an oscilloscope, something I have a hard time pronouncing, and so if you are in electrical engineering and you are mad about my butchering of the pronunciation of it, I apologize. But it's a tool used in electronics engineering and electronics in general to show the wavelength of electricity as it passes through something. And very early on, tinkerers in their garages developed things they could plug into these devices and turn them into games. The picture on the right is an example of a thing called Tennis for Two, where you could plug those little controllers here on the side into the oscilloscope, and it would turn it into a game of tennis. Keep that in mind. Tennis will come back later as a really good idea for video games. But the first thing we could call a video game as we actually know and understand what a video game is would be something like this. On the right there is a version of the game Space War. It was called Space War with an exclamation point, and it was developed by a garage tinkerer named Steve Russell. The game itself was kind of like Asteroids, if you've ever played that old arcade game. And it was on one of the very, very, very first early take-home personal computers that the game was developed for. And this was kind of, in history, we would consider it the first traditional video game. They weren't really popular. They weren't really a thing that you wouldn't buy one of these computers, which were very expensive. You wouldn't buy it just to play games. You bought it to tinker around with if you were somebody who liked electronics and liked technology, and you just might happen to play this game once in a while. But the game wasn't the selling point. And in arcades, there had been a development of some sort of kind of like video game systems. Sega, for example, made a lot of these. On the left here is an example of one called Periscope. And they were video games without the screen. They used mechanical things to take the place of a screen. So with Periscope, for example, you put your eye up next to a periscope thing in front of the system that would make it look like a submarine periscope. And when you looked through that, it would simulate a small camera in the back of the device where you could shoot other submarines or ships. A Speedway was sort of a same thing on the right here. On the background there, this is not actually a screen. This is a series of film that would scroll and scan behind it to make it look like you were driving, almost like how old Hollywood films used to do. So again, mechanical devices that were very similar to a video game, but not purely a video game. Technically, our story starts in 1972, and that's when Magnavox puts out the first ever video game console called the Magnavox Odyssey. There it is right here. The controller, if you could call it that, was plugged into the device, and it had a series of 2 knobs and 1 button. And it wasn't great in terms of at least comparing it to stuff that would come later. All it could really do is, when you plugged it into the television, it could create a series of lines and squares on the TV, but it couldn't produce any other visual context needed to make a game work. So how it worked is when you bought a Magnavox Odyssey, it came with a series of sticky films that you would put on your television screen. They were sort of like cellophane, and the static from the TV screen would keep them clung to the front of the TV set. And then the lights produced by the game through the television would shine through that cling film, and you would be able to play a series of games. And you could change the game by changing the cling film attached to the front of your screen. So this one over here is roulette, for example, and this was something that involved a haunted house. Here's an example of one of those screens sort of clung to the front of an old CRT television with a Magnavox Odyssey hooked up to it, and you can see the light square shining through whatever this game happens to be. It looks like something set up in the Old West. But that was about as good as you could get. Now the thing is, even though these weren't great, they did sell pretty well. People did like the Magnavox Odyssey. And the development of this launched a whole lot of other companies. People realized, okay, well, these companies out in California are making money on these video game systems like Magnavox, and so we ought to start up our own companies to help develop these things or develop games. And so one of the very early startup companies to develop games was a company called Atari, which we will hear a lot about here in the future. And one of the employees that they hired very early on, as a matter of fact, their third ever hired employee, was a guy named Alan Alcorn. Al Alcorn. There's his picture here on the right. And what they do with Al Alcorn is when they hire him at Atari, they give him a Magnavox Odyssey and they say, look, just reverse engineer the thing. Take it apart, figure out how in the world Magnavox makes this thing work, and let's use that technology to make our own system that we can sell that'll work hopefully a little bit better. And one of the things they were actually looking at was that there was a tennis game on the Magnavox Odyssey that was pretty popular, and specifically they wanted Alcorn to reverse engineer that tennis game. And Alcorn did, and in the process developed this. It was a plain black screen with a dotted line through the middle that was meant to simulate a net, and there was 2 lines on either side that you could twist knobs to make the lines go up and down, and they would kick these dots back and forth to each other. And the thing became known as Pong because it was a lot like ping pong. And Pong was initially developed by Atari as an arcade game. Here it is in a very plain arcade cabinet with the basic letters Pong at the top. There's the 2 knobs here at the bottom that you would use to twist to control the line, simulating the player with a net, for example, or a player with the tennis racket going up and down, or the ping pong paddle. And Pong was incredibly popular. Pong started being installed in a lot of arcades, and you would pay quarters to play, just like you would with pinball. So Pong was immediately a smash hit. Arcades were ordering these things left and right. And one of the reasons they were doing this is because in 1974, which is only a few years after the invention of the Magnavox Odyssey, the arcade industry, which at the time was just pinball machines for the most part, really crashed. Sort of the first of the series of crashes we'll talk about in this series of lectures. At the time, arcades and pinball arcades specifically were not what we think of when we think of arcades nowadays. Arcades back then were kind of seedy. The bars usually served alcohol. They were usually meant for adults and older teenagers. They weren't places where you would say wholesome people hung out. Pinball arcades back in the 70s were kind of grungy places to be. But as the pinball industry starts to crash, and particularly pinball arcades start to crash because people don't want to go there anymore because it's sort of Steedy, you could smoke inside. They serve alcohol. It's kind of a gross place to be. Arcades start replacing their pinball tables with video game cabinets. And there's a couple reasons for this. One of which is that pinball tables are really expensive. They are really expensive to buy, and they're really expensive to maintain. It requires near weekly maintenance to have somebody come in and check all the wires to make sure they're working good, and the solenoids and the little pistons that fire off to make all the pieces and parts move. They require a lot of maintenance, way more maintenance than a video game cabinet does, because a video game cabinet is just a little tiny computer in a box. There's less moving parts to break. And so they start replacing their expensive pinball tables with video game cabinets. Corresponding with that, it's when video games start to get, in arcades, pretty darn good. You get games like Breakout and Missile Command that were colorful and had really fun sound, and they were bright and they were lively. And you started to see this shift in arcades, where arcades replaced the bar with just places to sell snacks and sodas as opposed to alcohol. They made it so that you couldn't smoke indoors in arcades. And as these changes start to happen and the pinball tables give way to the arcade cabinets with video games in them, arcades become much more kid-friendly. It becomes much more of a thing that children would go and do and spend a lot of money in quarters to play Breakout or to play Missile Command. So arcades themselves become very family-friendly, and they become very big money makers. And of course, if there is the ability to make money off of this stuff, then they're going to figure out other ways of making money off of it. And so companies like Atari realized, hey, why don't we sell Pong for the home device? So telegames is one of the first things that Atari started selling. You can see here on the left is a version that is for Pong. On the right, they weren't the only ones with the idea. A company called Coleco developed the Telstar, which sounded a lot like telegames. And they were essentially things you could take, unbox, plug into the back of your television, and play Pong on at home. They couldn't do anything else except for Pong, but they did sell pretty well because Pong was such a popular thing, and so the idea of playing Pong at home really appealed to a lot of people. Now, Atari wasn't the first person to come up with this idea of expanding out selling a video game to the average take-home consumer. It was actually another company called Fairchild. Fairchild was a semiconductor company at the time. They did a lot of other stuff in technology, and they had a very small division that they put together to help try to develop a video game system. On the right here is Jerry Lawson, who is one of the unsung heroes of the early video game world. He has unfortunately passed away now. Jerry Lawson is the guy who came up with the idea while working at Fairchild in 1976 to develop a video game system where you would sell consumers, you would sell your customers a box, and that box was called the Channel F. The letter F stood for fun. You would sell them the box, and then you would program the different games onto these plastic boxes you would call cartridges. You could then sell them an unlimited number of different games that they would have to keep paying for, and they could keep putting it into that same cartridge system, that same box that you originally sold them, the console. They could keep going with that. So what this did was essentially make it so that the company could keep making more money. You sell your customer the console, the Channel F, and then you can sell them marked up games throughout the years, and you can make more money off of it. So the modern console for video games, where you buy a box, and then you have different games that that box will play, was an invention of the company Fairchild, and was really the idea here of Jerry Lawson, one of the very early developers for this kind of stuff. Also, Jerry Lawson, if you are into video games, is the guy who invented the pause button. He was at home tinkering with the Fairchild Channel F one day. He had ordered Chinese food, as the legend goes, and in the middle of playing around with one of the games that he had developed, realized when the door knocked for his Chinese food delivery that there really ought to be a way for us to just stop the game for a second so I can go get my Chinese food. So it was his idea of developing the pause button. Also, the whole entire modern video game console. So 1 year later, 1977, Atari realizes it really needs to follow Fairchild's footsteps. It had been selling individual take-home games. You could buy Pong, for example, on a system, plug it into your TV and play Pong, but you could only ever play Pong. So Atari realizes, hey, we need to go with this thing Fairchild's doing. We need to make our own console that we can then sell games for. And so they do this, and they call it the Atari 2600. And it is the first blockbuster, huge-selling video game system in the United States. Just look at it. Isn't it wonderful? I really love that they put wood paneling on the front of the thing. It just makes it look classy. And as you can see here, the Atari 2600 is set up very similar to the Fairchild Channel F. There is a slot in the front where you can put game cartridges, and changing out the game cartridge will change the game that you play. Everything is set to have the same controller, which is a basic joystick and one red button. And Atari produces their own catalog of games. Everything from combat to Starship to racing games like Indy 500 and Street Racer, to card games like Blackjack, to educational games like Basic Math. They sold this wide array of different games for their system. And initially, people kind of didn't get it. Sales were pretty slow at first. But something was about to happen that would change the direction and the course of these sales throughout time. And that is that Japanese companies were making really fresh, new, really, really good arcade games. Companies like Nintendo were developing their new game called Donkey Kong, which was a smash hit in arcades. And speaking of smash hits, the Japanese company Namco developed a game called Pac-Man, which was also a smash hit. So these Japanese companies were developing better games and releasing them in arcades in the United States market, and people loved to put quarters into these things all day long. They were very popular. So Atari gets a bright idea, and that is, hey, why don't we go to some of these companies that are producing these really popular arcade games, and let's just rent the rights from them. Let's make it so that they will help us, or we can do it ourselves. We'll develop the same game you can play in an arcade, but we'll make it so that you can play it on the 2600. We'll go in halvesies with the companies that are developing them for the arcades, and we'll split the money with them, and we will allow people to buy these titles for their home devices. The very first one of these was Space Invaders. Space Invaders had been a very popular arcade game. You can see it here. This is the side of the arcade cabinet. And Atari got the bright idea of going to the company that made it and said, hey, let's make a version of it that plays on the Atari 2600 and people can play Space Invaders at home. And it was pretty good. This is a screenshot of the version of Space Invaders you could play for the 2600. It wasn't nearly as big, it wasn't as flashy, it wasn't as fast, it didn't have nearly as many colors, but if you bought it once, you didn't have to keep dumping quarters into a machine. You buy it for your Atari 2600 and then you can just play Space Invaders as long as you want to. And a lot of people really liked that idea. And so by 1980, Atari sales are through the roof. They're selling $180 million worth of 2600 consoles alone. By 1981, we're looking at a huge increase up to $840 million, and then by 1982, it was over $1 billion just in selling consoles. That is not even counting the money that Atari was making from selling the individual games to people. But as we know from this being a lesson about the great video game crash of 1983, that things go south at some point. By 1983, all the video game companies in the United States combined, if you add them all together, are making less than $100 million in sales. So, what in the world happened that causes that great of a crash? Why did Atari suddenly lose everything they were building on for so long? Well, for that, you'll have to follow up with the next video.